Mayor and Council, our next work session presentation is a discussion of police services, including crime statistics, recruiting, hiring, training, community engagement, use of force, accountability, and the final report of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. We have our Chief of Police and Assistant City Manager, Ryan Holt.
All right, Mayor and Council, I'm here today to give you an update on the police department and to address discussion items surrounding policy, staffing, recruiting, and interactions with the community. The first couple of slides are going to be just to give some context for today's conversation. The department is currently authorized for 260 sworn positions and right around 100 civilian support staff. The department is comprised of 3 divisions, which are known as Community Services or Patrol, Criminal Investigations, and then Support Services. Some quick stats for 2019. We received 379,000 calls to the Waco PD Dispatch Center. Of those, 243,000 and a little more were administrative calls or calls to detectives for follow-up. 135,000 911 calls for service were received by the 911 center for Waco PD, and 104,000 or so of those were dispatched out to officers in the field. Of those 104,000 calls dispatched to officers in the field, 20,455 resulted in a police report, with 2,239 felony arrests and 3,400 misdemeanor arrests. This slide shows the demographics of the sworn members of the department over time compared to national averages in law enforcement and in comparison to the city of Waco population as a whole. As you can see, we've been making slow progress in this initiative, but making progress nonetheless. The column titled BOJS 2013 is the Bureau of Justice Statistics analysis of U.S. police departments in 2013, or the demographics in those departments in 2013. They have not done a study since then. Additionally, demographics by gender. As you can see, we continue to be above the national average and have been very pleased with the outcomes for female officers in the department, and have been pleased with the outcomes that this has manifested within the department workforce. In conjunction with the national conversation on policing, we've seen a few different campaigns centered around policing tactics. One of the campaigns that we most often see in our email boxes is the 8 Can't Wait campaign. The department responded early on social media that the concerns identified in the campaign have long been addressed by the Waco Police Department. The first bullet point, ban chokeholds and strangleholds. For more than 20 years, the Waco PD has not permitted or trained these types of restraints to gain submission or control. The second bullet point, requiring de-escalation. De-escalation is part of the culture and ongoing training for all department staff. The policy was developed in alignment with the 21st Century Policing Report and concepts of procedural justice that ensures actions by our officers are proportional, legal, authorized, necessary, and ethical. The third bullet point is to require warning before shooting. Our policy states that an officer should identify themselves and state their purpose, that force may be used except in situations where doing so places any person at a greater risk of harm. The next bullet point, exhaust all other means before shooting. Our policy states we will only use the amount of force that appears reasonably necessary given the facts and circumstances of the encounter. A duty to intervene. Any officer that observes a person being mistreated in any way has a duty to intervene by verbal or physical means and must immediately report that to the department. A ban on shooting at moving vehicles. Shooting at vehicles is not permitted unless the person in the vehicle is attempting to use deadly force towards the officer or another person. Establishing a use of force continuum. Officers receive extensive de-escalation training and are taught to only use the amount of force that is reasonably necessary in response to a perceived threat. Require all force to be reported. All use of force incidents are documented and reviewed by a chain of supervisors, then analyzed by professional standards, the training unit, and the chief of police. Some of the conversation lately has been around identifying those items that law enforcement should be doing in the new century. In 2015, President Obama formed a panel selected from law enforcement officers and executives, community members, civic leaders, advocates, researchers, academics, and others to look at potential advances and reforms in policing. The task force recommendations, each with action items, are organized around 6 main topic areas or pillars. They are building trust and legitimacy, policy and oversight, technology and social media, community policing and crime reduction, officer training and education, and officer safety and wellness. The task force made a total of 156 recommendations and action items. The 63 recommendations are followed with 93 actions that the task force sees as needed in today's law enforcement environment. Additionally, the task force also recommended that the President support programs that take a comprehensive and inclusive look at community-based initiatives addressing core issues such as poverty, education, and health and safety. The 117-page report provides a total of 156 recommendations and action items combined. Of those, 67 are identified as being in the purview of local law enforcement. 66 are assigned to federal authorities, 6 to public schools, 6 to the community as a whole, 5 to the licensing agency in each state, in our case, which is the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement, 2 for the juvenile justice system, 2 for local prosecutors to consider, and 1 for the states to consider, and 1 for academia. Of the 67 recommendations or action items, 33 are just recommendations and 34 are action items. I took the report and created an inventory matrix and then conducted an analysis of each item. That inventory, along with the link to the original report, will be sent to each of you by email after this presentation. 38 of the 67 combined actions and recommendations are ongoing, completed, or substantially implemented in the Waco Police Department. In these, we will also continue to evaluate to ensure we are following best practices and meeting the expectations of our community. A couple of example items for the ones that have been implemented, such as action item 2.7.1, law enforcement agencies policies should address procedures for implementing a layered response to mass demonstrations that prioritize de-escalation and a guardian mindset. Example of that is currently our practice, but we need to codify it into policy. The next one is 3.2.1. Law enforcement agencies should encourage public engagement and collaboration, including the use of community advisory bodies when developing a policy for the use of a new technology. And a good example of that is our most recent body-worn camera policy, where we engaged several community groups to have input on that policy and its final outcome. 22 of the items could be done with either additional resources or policy development. A couple of examples in that category are action item 1.3.1, to embrace a culture of transparency, law enforcement agencies should make all department policies available for public review and regularly post on the department's website information about stops, summonses, arrests, reported crime, and other law enforcement data. The result is we do post stats on our website, but however, to post our policies publicly, we currently operate under a system of general orders which combines policies and procedures, and we would need to go through the general orders and separate out the policy from the procedures and publish the policies to the public. Additionally, action item 4.2.2, law enforcement agencies should evaluate their patrol deployment practices to allow sufficient time for patrol officers participate in problem-solving and community engagement activities. This action item would potentially need additional patrol staff as that staffing issue is based on calls for service. 6 of the items of the 67 for local agencies pose significant or potential significant barriers like conflicting state law or a significant shift in policy or labor relations. An example would be action item 1.4.2. Law enforcement agency leadership should examine opportunities to incorporate procedural justice into the internal discipline process, placing additional importance on values adherence rather than adherence to rules. That would require potential changes in Texas civil service, state labor relationships, and case law, which make this one particularly challenging to implement. I'll describe civil service more in the coming slides. There are 121 general orders that combine policy and procedures that direct employees in the Waco Police Department. These general orders are in addition to city policy, state or federal statutes, local rules established by the Civil Service Commission, or the negotiated meet and confer agreements with the Waco Police Association. As a civil service department, we're governed specifically by Texas Local Government Code Section 143. We also have a local civil service board made of citizens that serve in that capacity as commissioners. They are currently Enid Wade, Don Montgomery, and Francine Halliburton Francis. The commission administers Chapter 143, or what's known as the State Civil Service Statute, which includes establishing rules and regulations regarding hiring and dismissal of firefighters and police officers. The commissioners are appointed by the city manager and confirmed by the council. Different sections of 143 cover entrance exams, hiring, probationary periods, promotions, temporary assignments, various compensation components, specific requirements for discipline, the appeal process for discipline, including the use of a hearing examiner or local civil service board, demotions, leave, determination of physical and mental fitness, access to personnel files, suspensions, among many other aspects of employment of police officers. Coupled with portions of other codes and various judicial and administrative rulings, it also provides guidelines through which the internal affairs and investigative policy and process are formed. Waco PD accepts complaints from citizens or from employees within the department. Complaint forms are available on the website or at the front desk of the police department, both in English and in Spanish. Additionally, instructions on how to make a complaint or a compliment are printed on the back side of our citation forms as required by state law. Complaints are taken for anything that, if proven true, would be a violation of policy or law. We do not take complaints about the charge of traffic violations, for example. If you get a speeding citation and you don't think you were speeding, that is left up to the legal process at the municipal court. Once a complaint is received, the employee must be served in writing that they are the subject of a complaint and an investigation. If there is an allegation of criminal conduct, a separate and distinct criminal investigation is opened by the department as well. In situations where criminal conduct is alleged, the employee is put on leave during the investigation and are prohibited from acting in a law enforcement capacity during that period. Anonymous complaints or complaints from citizens who wish for their name to be withheld are accepted, but they can only result in discipline if the department is able to find independent evidence of a policy or law violation. Once the employee has been notified of the complaint, the employee's direct supervisor is assigned to complete the investigation, except in situations where the allegation is about excessive or unnecessary force, an allegation of criminal conduct, racial profiling, death or serious injury of a civilian due to police actions, or significant occurrences that the chief determines should better be investigated by the IA sergeant, or when two or more employees from different sections are involved. In those cases, the Professional Standards and Conduct Supervisor, also known as Internal Affairs, conducts the investigation. The IA sergeant reports directly to the chief so that no undue influence can be exerted on the investigation. Even in situations where the employee supervisor conducts the investigation, the IA sergeant is responsible for ensuring the investigation is thorough and complete. Once the investigation is complete, a determination can be one of 5 possible outcomes. The first is sustained. That is that the allegation is true and that the employee's conduct was inconsistent with rules or procedures of the City of Waco and or the Waco Police Department or other laws. It could be not sustained, which means there is insufficient evidence to prove or disprove the allegation. It could be unfounded, which means that the alleged conduct or action did not occur. It could be exonerated, which means that the action complained of occurred. However, the conduct or action was lawful, proper, and in accordance with departmental rules and procedures. And finally, the investigation could be canceled, and that is if the investigation cannot be completed because the employee has resigned or died, the complainant refused to cooperate in the investigation if that refusal makes it impossible to determine whether a policy violation occurred, or the chief of police determines that the investigation will discontinue or no disciplinary action will be imposed. Regardless of the findings, once the investigation is complete, each level of the chain of command must review the investigation, and if the allegation is sustained, they must each make a disciplinary recommendation to accompany the investigation to the chief. Due to civil service and labor statutes, the chief is ultimately the only person who can impose discipline. Before discipline is imposed, if there is a recommendation involving a suspension, the officer may respond in writing to the findings. They may also request a peer review board to review the investigation and the disciplinary recommendations, or they may request a meeting with the chief to discuss the investigation. All of the recommendations from the chain of command or the peer review board are advisory to the chief of police. If discipline is to be handed out, discipline can take two forms as a result of an IA investigation. They are classified as informal and formal discipline. Informal discipline can either be an oral reprimand that's documented in writing, or a written reprimand. Formal discipline can be a suspension of work time up to and including 15 days. Beyond 15 days, the chief can only impose an indefinite suspension, or under certain circumstances, the chief can issue a longer suspension of 15 days, but only if agreed to by the employee. Informal discipline cannot be appealed. Formal discipline, however, can be appealed to either the Civil Service Commission or to an independent hearing examiner. The rulings provided by the Civil Service Commission or the hearing examiner are binding except in very narrow circumstances. Once discipline is imposed, the final memo to the officer in cases of formal discipline become public information and are placed in the officer's civil service file. All documents related to informal discipline are placed in a file that can only be accessed by the head of the agency or by court order. Because the IA process is our only disciplinary process offered under civil service, you find that the majority of investigations are a result of administrative issues such as being late for work, or operational issues like backing a vehicle into a pole in a city vehicle. They also encompass more serious internal behavior such as insubordination, violation of emergency driving policies, or failing to search a detainee thoroughly. Of course, the IA process also covers serious conduct such as unnecessary uses of force, excessive use of force, racial profiling, untruthfulness, and other conduct that could be considered criminal in nature. Regardless of the allegation, the vast majority of these complaints are initiated by department personnel holding our own employees to a higher standard. The graph on the screen shows for the last 4 years and the current year to date the number of sustained complaints and the number of complaints that were closed out in one of those other categories. The range shows that in each of those years, the bottom end was an oral reprimand. In some years, the higher end was days off. In a couple of the years, an indefinite suspension was issued out. And in a couple of cases, employees resigned during the investigation. This graph shows the origination of the complaints. As you can see, the vast majority of complaints come from within the department, employees holding each other accountable or supervisors initiating complaints against officers. And these are the sworn stats. These don't include our civilian staff. There was one anomaly in 2018. You can see there was a higher number of citizen complaints. When we looked at that, there was one incident involving 6 or 7 officers where a citizen alleged an improper search of a residence. That one was investigated very thoroughly and was found to be unfounded at the time.
Chief,
Yes, ma'am.
so back to that 2018 slide, you said there were 6 or 7 officers indicated. So were there multiple people per case? Is that why it was 21?
Right. So they had alleged that it was improper, that it was an improper arrest, and they alleged that it was an improper search. And so all those combined with 7 people mean there's a higher number from a citizen than normal.
And for public information, were any of the investigations I will take within the past 4 years excessive force?
Yes. And we publish a report at the end of each calendar year that's put on the internet. So I'll I'll just go to the most current year just to talk about that one as an example. So in 2020, I believe there is a use of force complaint that we got last week that is still under investigation. It's one of those 3 that's currently under investigation. In 2019, there was, I see one excessive force made by a citizen. 2 officers were the subject of that. And at the end of that, they were exonerated of that conduct. I can keep going if you need me to. Okay.
No, I know that from what the reports that we've seen and read, the numbers have been historically low. I just needed the statement to be made.
Yes, ma'am. All right. And the next slide, we're going to talk about the officer's response to resistance. I just wanted to give a brief definition of force. There have been some different definitions floating around on social media. Force is defined in state law as physical contact made with a subject to compel the subject to submit to authority for a search, detainment, arrest, or defend a person from an illegal act. This physical conduct may be made with a bodily contact alone or assisted with a device. And so at the Waco Police Department, employees must document the following on a non-lethal force administrative report form and on offense and supplemental police reports. And that is when an officer uses one of the following. It can be a strike, a chemical agent, an impact device, an electronic control device, and that includes misses with that device, or a canine bite. The completed non-lethal force administrative report form is attached to relevant offense reports and sent for review through the entire chain of command to the officer's assistant chief for review, and then the assistant chief determines final review of that incident and sends it to the chief. It's also reviewed by the training unit as well. We do document attempts to use force, not just the effective use of force. For example, if you look at the column with taser usage, in 2016 we had 12 misses. In 2017 we had 10 misses. In 2018 and 2019 each we had 5 misses. And so even though the taser wasn't effectively used against a person, we do document the attempt to use that. You can see in comparison to the number of interactions that the police department has in the city each year that the use of force is out to the second decimal place in percentages.
Hey, Chief, just a couple of questions on that chart.
Yes, sir.
Defensive tactics and impact. Talk a little bit about what those 2 things are.
So impact are using like an ASP expandable baton. We don't use the old PR-24 batons like they did in the old days, but some of our officers do still carry the ASP baton, and occasionally the blunt end of a flashlight can be used on pressure points to affect compliance. You can see from the numbers that is very rarely used. Most officers have gotten away from any of those tools for impact. Defensive tactics are so there's 2 types of defensive tactics. There's soft empty hand and hard empty hand. So a soft empty hand would not require a report, and that would be if I grab your arm to handcuff you, that's a soft empty hand control tactic. However, if you resist and I administer a strike to the common peroneal to gain compliance, we would document that on a foam. I'm sorry. Common peroneal is a pressure point that you can use to gain compliance. It's a soft tissue spot in your muscle group that if you use a palm or an elbow or something to apply pressure to that area, it gets your attention in a hurry. So those are the 2 types of empty hand control, and so those are defensive tactics.
But just to be clear, that's not, you're not talking about the neck or throat when you're talking about the common peroneal.
No restraint around the neck is permitted except in deadly force situations. And at that point in time, if you're authorized under state law to use deadly force, it's pretty much anything you can use to defend yourself as a police officer and gain control of the suspect at that point.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Chief, just to piggyback off of that
Sure.
mayor's question, am I to assume that by this, well, let me ask this, what is OC spray? I'm sorry.
So that's OC stands for oleoresin capsicum. It's pepper spray is all it means. It's
Which is completely different from tear gas.
absolutely. And there are two types of tear gas. I've seen this in the news. There is CN tear gas and there is CS tear gas. CN has been outlawed for a number of years and has not been used by law enforcement that I've ever been around for decades. When I first got into law enforcement, I saw some old canisters of CN, and that is the old style military tear gas that was used way back when. Police departments, particularly in Central Texas, moved to CS gas, which is essentially the pepper in the gaseous form. So that it's an irritant but doesn't cause long-lasting damage.
And Waco PD does use CS gas.
We have CS gas in our inventory, but it's used in very specific circumstances under very controlled means.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that for me, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir. All right. So I'd like to move along to talk about recruiting and hiring and our efforts in that area. The amount of attrition lately is something that we've been dealing with. What we've seen is that from 2018 or 2015 and 2016, where we would have 8 or so folks either leave through either resigning or retiring or being asked to leave the department. We're now up to 15 or 16 a year. So that number has doubled for us. In 2020, we've already seen 7 year to date for the calendar year. And so what we're seeing now is about a turnover of about 5.7% of the department each year. Just like we talked about civil service earlier, the civil service statutes guide our hiring process. We do give a civil service test. When we give a civil service test, we will provide training on how to prepare and take the civil service test. In fact, there's a study guide out on our website currently. We also provide a video on how to do the physical agility test and provide a time to practice before the day of the official test. We can only hire people that apply, and then we can only hire people in the order that they score on the test. But there is a good thing in that civil service provides 5 extra points on the written test for military service that ends in an honorable discharge. The current negotiated meet and confer contract also allows us to hire police officers from other law enforcement agencies or who have been employed by such an agency within the last 12 months and left in good standing. And there is incentive pay for that. If you come from a police department in Texas and you have at least 2 years of service, we can start those officers at 2-year pay. If you come from the state of Texas or a city or county serving more than 50,000 people and have 5 years of service there, we can start you at 5-year pay. We also have some opportunities for out-of-state officers who are willing to challenge the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement test, and we can hire them. We just can't start them out at higher rates of pay. For recruiting efforts, we have targeted advertising on Facebook and Twitter. We targeted those by demographics and location, although we're being told now that Facebook is changing their rules so that you can't do any targeted advertising related to housing, employment, or credit by location, age, gender, or race. I know that Councilmember Meek had suggested we use Snapchat. Unfortunately, Snapchat offers some challenges in capturing those posts for open records, and so at least at this point in time, we're unable to use Snapchat. During the last recruiting efforts, we ran 30 to 40 spots a week on KWTX in different segments. We ran it on TV Fox 44. We ran radio spots on 104.9 Bob FM, 104.1 La Lay, Power 108, and 94.5 The Beat. I challenged my staff to get into schools that we hadn't previously worked at and historically black universities. They quickly told me that schools don't have newspapers anymore. They're online. And so we placed web-based ads and publications at Prairie View A&M, Paul Quinn College, Grambling State University, and additionally with the TCOL website, which goes out to individuals looking to go into the police career. We also place site visits, and with universities, it's difficult sometimes to match up their recruiting and job fairs with our cycle of hiring. Our cycle of hiring has to fit with the MCC Academy because that's who runs our regional academy, and so the timing doesn't always line up that we can get to everybody's job fairs, but we did most recently complete visits to Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Charleston State University in Stephenville, MCC at Waco, La Vega High, Connolly High School, and we also made site visits to San Antonio and Corpus Christi. In addition, we went a little bit outside of our normal scope this past time and placed targeted billboards in the DFW Metroplex trying to get sworn officers when we saw some dissatisfaction with agencies in the Metroplex area. We also ran a Work for Waco commercial at the local cinemas at PG-13 and below movies.
But Chief, before you move on,
Yes, ma'am.
In recruiting efforts, I would never forget Houston Tillotson right down the street in Austin.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious. So, like, I know with my husband's in education. So with the Texas Association of Black School Educators, they have alliances and groups, and I assume that Black and brown officers have some sort of coalitions. When they have conferences, has anyone considered going to them and recruiting at those types of the women officers, all of the things that separate out the demographics that we are intentionally recruiting for equity purposes? Have those efforts been made in that manner?
No, but those are fantastic ideas, and I've made notes here. Sometimes some of the other business organizations or constituent organizations, sometimes they feel like we may be trying to poach their employees, so we have to be a little careful about that. But I'm willing to poach, so we will certainly give it a try.
I'm sure with those organizations, they have events,
Yes, ma'am.
that go to, and you just belong to the organization, one, and then that way, if a ad book or something should happen to pass through at an event, it's just a flying W that's amazing that says, why not?
Yes, absolutely. I do when various law enforcement organizations are having their conferences here in Waco, and I've been asked to give keynote addresses, and I always leave my card and tell folks we're hiring. So
right.
I'm not afraid to poach officers at all from that. So, but
Before
thank
I
you.
let you pass on this effort, when you said the academy cycles, we making sure that the job fairs match up the academy cycles. How many cycles are there in a year, and are they set?
Yes, ma'am. So typically, the MCC Academy starts in January and July.
Okay.
And so what we have to do is we back up about 12 months before each one of those dates. We sort of work backwards, and we figure out when we can give the civil service test, and then there's about 6 months of hiring process. I think some of y'all may have heard me talk about the fact that both Waco High and University High and La Vega and some of the other local schools have criminal justice programs in the high schools, and they're tremendous groups of kids that are interested in law enforcement, but we lose them from the time they turn 18 till the time they turn 21. Life happens, or they go decide to do something different. And so we have been working over the last couple of years, and we've talked to MCC about things that we can do to engage those kids in that interim time period. Matter of fact, I think in the officers I introduced earlier, we got one of those kids from La Vega. And so he had been in the criminal justice programs over there. He's two of our folks in that academy turned 21 in the academy, which is very unusual for us. We typically like to hire folks that are a little older, have plenty of life experience and wisdom and discernment on when to use that wisdom. But they both of those kids, and I say kids, they're all younger than me at this point. But both of them were just outstanding individuals and had really done the groundwork and were very mature for their age. One of them was from Waco, and the other one wasn't, but their families were, had just provided outstanding stability for them, and we were fortunate to get them at such a young age. So we absolutely are going to continue all of our efforts with our local school districts as well.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to highlight our ongoing training efforts as well. In the academy, recruits get several hours of ethics, multiculturalism, and human relations. And one they've had to add for the newer generations, communication and problem solving, or how to talk to people. All of that is included in the academy. What we're seeing is, particularly with younger individuals that have only grown up with smartphones, is that they're used to texting. And so we engage them a lot in scenario training, just to how to talk to people in a way that encourages folks to get along, and all that's included in the academy. But then the department also conducts a number of the following classes for both the new officers that come out and our officers through their career. That includes follow-up training on implicit bias, civilian interaction training, de-escalation training, interaction with deaf drivers, cultural diversity, a 40-hour crisis intervention class, and others, among others like human trafficking as well. Additionally, I've had the opportunity to participate in the Race Equity Institute training locally. We have worked with the Cooper Foundation and the Waco Foundations, and we're working our way through the entire executive staff and command staff at the police department. And I've also had extensive conversations with Ashley at the Cooper Foundation, and she knows that I'd like to get through all 37 sergeants through that training as well. Of course, they try to maintain a balance in those classes, so it can take a little while to get everybody over there. However, our sergeant over our Crimes Against Children unit has already attended that training. In addition to the RAI training, I think y'all are aware that I took some of our staff out to San Jose to look at a training program in San Jose that really focused in on the policing in America and what it means to put on the badge and the uniform, and what it means to the different groups and different populations that we serve, because that uniform means something to different people, and it talks about how police have been used by governments to adversely affect communities of color. Because of COVID, I had originally wanted to try to get that rolled out to our folks coming out of the July Academy. Due to COVID, we're backed up a couple of months, but we're working with one of the staff members out at San Jose just to make sure there's no issues with their curriculum and our curriculum. Ours is going to be much more centered on Texas and Waco in particular. As y'all know, there's plenty of material there for Waco and Texas to talk about in that class. In addition, Mr. Ford has engaged us to look at that program potentially for other city employees, to expand it across the city to share that information. We try to host additional cutting-edge training for all Central Texas law enforcement. This September, we're going to host a class called Understanding Human Performance in Critical Incidents. And so we're always trying to look for new things that allow police officers to identify how they operate in very stressful situations. From a social media standpoint, Our Facebook page has 55,900 followers. We have 23,400 followers on Twitter, and our interim public information officer, Garen Bynum, is restarting our Instagram page. For community outreach, in 2019, the community outreach section presented 244 crime prevention and education programs, reaching just under 20,000 citizens. We hosted our 55th and 56th Citizens Police Academy and our 8th Junior Police Academy involving a combined total of 65 citizens and students. We were really disappointed that due to COVID, we couldn't host the Junior Police Academy this summer, as that's a highlight for our students and frankly for the police officers that are involved in teaching that class. We also conducted the annual Red Ribbon Week anti-drug message involving local, county, state, and federal law enforcement agencies, which was presented to 6 area county schools involving 3,000 elementary students. As you know, the City of Waco and the City of Waco Police Department placed 15th nationally in our promotion of the National Night Out event. The Citizens Police Academy and the Citizens Police Academy Alumni Association, Citizens on Patrol, and police chaplains all volunteered, contributing 6,000 hours to the Waco Police Department. One of the things I'm really proud of is that our Blue Santa program, supported by officers and the Citizens Police Academy Alumni Association, was able to provide food, toys, and personal items to over 100 families during the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays of 2019. Before COVID, we conducted a number of Coffee with a Cop programs. We host and participate in numerous panels and special interest group discussions. Our staff, particularly the executive staff, serve on various boards and community groups. We also have additional opportunities with ride-alongs. We encourage citizen ride-alongs. The Citizens Police Academy is a highlight, I think, as Citizens on Patrol. And then of particular interest is our victim services volunteers. We provide response to the scene, and our volunteers support our actual employees at that. They respond to the scene of violent crimes and provide assistance to the victims and their families. And now, any discussion that council would like to have?
This is Holmes. Chief Holt, thanks for the presentation, brilliant presentation. I appreciate your comments, and not only today, but your statement in response to the Floyd incident from a couple weeks ago is also right on point. You know, it's such an important topic right now: community policing, community outreach, the mutual trust and the mutual respect that you build with the community. You know, it's not easy, and it can be, you know, very fragile at times. But I think we've set a good foundation here in Waco. When this 8 can't wait policy discussion came out, I wasn't as familiar with each of the 8. And so I was frankly, you know, a little anxious that our department wasn't following each one of those. And that was followed by, you know, relief, you know, happiness and pride, I guess, that we, the City of Waco and our department is leading in those policies. The one thing that kind of pops out at me in the current environment, particularly as you talked about excessive use of force and unnecessary use of force and racial profiling in particular, are there, and I know a lot of this information has to be confidential, but some level of transparency or some level of consistency. And I'd like your comments on how our department, and I know you've commented some already, but just how our department, that's very important to us as a city, as a council, and as a department, that we that if those principles are violated, that there is consequence. So that I'm going to ask 2 questions, and I'll just go off and listen. The other one is the mental health aspects. How much of policing is kind of morphing into mental health sort of management, and that maybe less so on that. If you answer one of the 2, the former is what I'd like to hear about. Thanks, Chief.
Sure. Yeah, so to your question about consequences, and I've had that question on some radio shows, and some reporters ask me that question. You know, they say, well, you can have all the policies in the world, but what happens if people violate those? And unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you look at it, it turns out we are humans to wear the badge and the uniform, and unfortunately, sometimes they do make mistakes. And I think we have a long history of high expectations set by previous chiefs, and I hope that I've continued that on. And where that leads you to is that sometimes you have to not only impose a little discipline, but sometimes you have to ask folks to leave the organization. And in serious matters, we have to hold ourselves accountable, and we have arrested our own officers. I've given out indefinite suspensions, and unfortunately, we have also arrested our own officers. That is a very low day in my career when that occurs, but at the same time, you have to do what's right, and we have to take pride in the badge that we put on and in the patch that represents the Waco Police Department. I said this out loud to our 12 new officers at their graduation the other day, that the profession, the integrity of the profession and your name and the integrity of the Waco Police Department are too important. We have to hold each other accountable. And sometimes that means that people no longer can be in law enforcement, and unfortunately it also means that sometimes we have to arrest our own officers. So I feel like that we have a strong history of consequence. Now, I will tell you that we try to be thoughtful and methodical, and we try to be fair, and we don't seek retribution. We seek fairness and justice in all of those processes. We try to be very thorough in our investigations, and we try to consider all of the issues at hand, particularly with civil service. One of the things that the independent hearing examiners want to know is if the chief, number one, has been thoughtful about the investigation. Has it been thorough and complete? But has the chief been fair and equitable in discipline recommendation? And has the chief been consistent? That's one of the challenges in civil services, that they want the chief to be consistent across the board. I will be honest, that's a little challenging for me, because on one hand, the labor unions will always say, well, this officer, you shouldn't treat this officer as harshly because they have a 30-year career. But then in the next time, they'll say, well, this one-year officer who did this, you have to treat them exactly the same as the 30-year officer. And I've said that out loud to the labor unions. They acknowledge that, but it is just part of the process. It is frustrating for a chief that you can't employ some procedural justice even within the department because of the box that you get pushed into from civil service. So there are some challenges there, but I feel like we have a strong reputation for consequence when something is done wrong. Mental health is a huge subject. I think some of y'all have heard me sort of yell from the mountaintops before about mental health and its challenges that it poses to local law enforcement. We get, on average, I think it's more now because we had a 36% increase in the last year of mental health calls, but we get about 3 to 4 mental health calls a day of somebody in crisis, where they've gone beyond normal intervention by a family member or a medical personnel. So police are called in. Inevitably, at least one of those a day ends in a detention. It's a very narrow scope of authority that's given to us in the civil code, where we can take a person against their will and take them for an emergency detention, for an emergency mental health evaluation. And those calls typically last several hours. Sometimes they last several days before officers can be relieved and turn that person over for long-term treatment. So that is a very challenging issue. Those calls for service have bypassed. In the old days, we used to say that domestic disturbances were the most dangerous call we went on. Now it's easily mental health crisis calls for a number of reasons. The first is that there's no culpability for mental health folks. They often don't mean to hurt the officers or to hurt their family members. That's not their intention. They don't have any. They can't form that kind of thought. But it still hurts nonetheless if you get hit by somebody just because they don't have any culpability, and somebody with no culpability can still kill you nonetheless. And so it's very challenging for officers. The other thing is that officers are expected to get on scene and diagnose people because people with different DSM-5 diagnoses and comorbidities you should treat differently than people with other diagnoses. And officers, people have PhDs and masters in mental health, and officers are expected to analyze those situations in very often difficult situations, often in the middle of the night, and determine the best course of action for the safety of everybody involved, including the mental health consumer. So those are very challenging cases and an opportunity, I think, for our community and community resources, both medical and government, to work together just like we are with the behavioral health leadership team. The mayor serves on that, the county judge and the CEOs of both hospitals and MHMR, and they're doing fantastic work trying to get grant funding. But the reality is that the state and federal systems have defunded the number of beds available for these mental health consumers that get into crisis year after year after year. And when nobody else can solve it, the public calls the police department and expects the police department to solve it. There are opportunities like the Colorado Springs model, which would place law enforcement with mental health providers and medical personnel to go out and try to keep mental health consumers before they go into crisis. So keep them on their medication, keep them going to the doctor, keep them stabilized, keep them as productive members of our communities, and so that they don't get into crisis and don't cause harm or potential for harm for their families and or police officers. One thing that sort of I bristle at a little bit is in the national discussion, they say that, well, police are just putting these people in jail. And what I've seen is that for a number of years, particularly in Central Texas, because that's my perspective, is that we have for a number of years sought to not put people with mental health issues in jail. And frankly, and in the state of Texas, in two legislative sessions ago, the Sandra Bland Act actually prevents us from doing that. The McLennan County Jail is doing extensive work at the McLennan County Jail for mental health. And so that is a huge topic. And it certainly continues to be a challenge for our officers on a daily basis. And I believe it's an opportunity for us to divert that away from law enforcement. I don't know of a single police officer that would disagree with that. So that is a huge opportunity for us, Councilman Holmes.
Thank you, Chief. That's all I have.
I'll jump in here. Chief, thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to start off by saying, first and foremost, congratulations on your 12 students that have just graduated. One thing that I was so proud as you were acknowledging them and recognizing them is the diversity that came along with this class, from not only a race background, but also a gender background. And so I really have to congratulate you on that. It is a representation of the community that we and they serve. And so I was so proud to see that. So I want to say thank you for doing that. I thank you for going through the procedures and policies that the Waco PD has implemented for years, including the 8 Can't Wait. I'm very proud to see that Waco PD is years ahead because of the groundwork that you and Waco PD has done with the NAACP, the local chapter of the NAACP, the local chapter of LULAC, and the groundwork that has been done. There is a great rapport and a great respect for Waco PD, and that things are done fairly and equitable and it just shows your leadership with the police department over the last few years. And so I have to congratulate you on that. But that also as a council member, has really encouraged me that Waco is ahead of other cities. Even cities that are 2, 3, 4 times larger than Waco, but yet we're still ahead of them as far as, procedures and protocols that we have banned and that we allow here. And so, the chokehold and the neck restraints that we do not, the de-escalating situation where one officer has to report another one when there is physical abuse taking place. And so I just really want to thank you for that. I also want to commend you for yourself and some of your sergeant and your leadership team that's going through the Race Equity Institute training. Very beneficial. I think it's a powerful thing when you as a leader tell your rest of your team, I'm doing this to make us better and to better serve our community, and that the people that serve underneath you are falling in line with that. So I really have to congratulate you on that. I thank you for addressing and attacking the mental health need that we have in our community, and in spite of still everything that's going on, not only here locally but around the country, there's still a mental health component of our community that we are still all looking to see, how do we address this, how do we combat this, how do we help our neighbors, our community, our constituents do this. And so even that you're addressing this and the work that's taking place, I really have to commend you on that. So Chief, I just want to say thank you for investing in the community and investing in relationships. It brings me joy to see Waco police officers at neighborhood association meetings. It brings me joy to see Waco police officers at the local high schools trying to recruit. I mean, we have some very, very capable and talented young adults here that are graduating high school, that are graduating college, and for them to join Waco PD, I think that speaks volumes. And so I really just want to say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for what's taking place. Thank you for the groundwork that has been laid. And the only thing I will end with this is, you were talking about the 22 local recommendations that could be done and possibly see how we can implement those. I would love the opportunity, whether it's through an informal report or a conversation with you, to see how we can implement those here locally as well, because I'm at your recommendation, of course, and see how we can just become better at what we do. But overall, thank you so much for just the work that you've done here in our community. It is very, very much appreciated.
Thank you, Councilman. I will say that it's all possible because we have a lot of really good men and women that work for y'all in the Waco Police Department, and they do it on a day-to-day basis. They make every interaction. They're putting money in the bank of trust with our citizens. They know that that's the expectation, but they're out there doing it every day, and they're doing the hard work, and I appreciate every one of them.
I'll jump in. First, I want to set the record straight. I'm not saying I didn't say it, but I don't ever remember saying anything about Snapchat. I don't have Snapchat. I've never had Snapchat. Maybe it's just something about Instagram. I don't know. But Esmeralda, if you're taking minutes, I'll do a correction and say I said Instagram and not Snapchat, but just remember about that. Hey, I'm so thankful for our force and you, Chief. I think being an honorable officer is noble and hard work. And I have so much respect for you. In this report, we've been able to hear, and as Jim mentioned, as your statement reflected, the thoughtful approach for policy that you've created. I'm proud of where we are. I know that, like all institutions, there's always things that we can do to get better. And I know that you as our chief and our police force and our council is committed to evaluating all of our systems to see where we could get better. One thing that I'm thankful this council did and thankful that you came to us with the recommendation was the body worn cameras. How is that? You mentioned that in your presentation, but
yes, sir.
How is that going? How are you feeling about that? What are some of the success stories that have come
Sure.
From that?
I'm a little biased, but I think it's been fantastic, actually. And it was adopted by the officers in a fantastic way. Some of the things that I warned about, unfortunately, have come to fruition, and we had a deadly use of force that occurred in the 1400 block of Spate, where the officer got out of her car and the suspect was stabbing the hotel manager, trying to kill the hotel manager, and so she had to use deadly force immediately and was not able to turn on her video camera or her body-worn camera. And so that was an example to us that there are going to be times when body-worn cameras, because you can't allow them to run for the entire shift. State law prevents us from doing that. And she had to take care of the safety of the person that was being stabbed to death, or trying to be stabbed to death. She had to intervene on his behalf quicker than, she couldn't be concerned about turning on a body-worn camera. Some of the success stories, there are just so many of them that show the great interactions of our officers with our public, because they're on for most interactions, and so you just get to see the good that our officers are doing. We've been able to see our officers do special things for citizens, like buy them gasoline or buy them food, or intervene in those ways, in addition to working regular calls for service in just tremendous ways. But one of the things it has done that pleased me was that it has allowed us to rebuke false accusations against our officers. I had one story I'll share with you, because it was so sort of outlandish to me, was that I had two, I don't know if I'd say elderly ladies, but they were very mature, called to complain about one of our just really fantastic officers who happens to be African American. And he went on a call for service and just did a tremendous job, was very polite. And these two mature ladies came and complained to the Internal Affairs Department that he was rude and wouldn't help them. And so we invited the ladies down to watch the video of the interaction. And at the end, they said, well, we've seen that, but that's not how we remember it. And so I was a little dumbfounded, and I just asked them. I said, "Well, what would you like me to do?" And ultimately they said, "Well, I guess we were wrong," and they left. And so there are those opportunities. We talked about that when we were getting these cameras, that this would be accountability for our officers, but it's also accountability for our public. And I think our officers see that. Particularly for those men and women who go to work every day and they try to serve the community in the best way they can, they see that camera is capturing those interactions. Now, one thing I'll warn against is that, frankly, there isn't a single use of force that looks good on camera. And so we have to be very careful when we are reviewing that video, that we look for appropriateness and we don't necessarily cast our own opinion about it in the light of day, that we have to take into consideration all of the factors that the officer was having to make decisions at split seconds, sometimes in the dark of night, in very hazardous conditions. And so sometimes we have to remind ourselves when we're reviewing that video footage that there's no use of force that looks good. And so we look for appropriateness. But I couldn't be more pleased, and I couldn't be more thankful that y'all as a council and that our management were forward-thinking enough to recognize the value of body-worn camera systems. I think it has been a tremendous service to your department and to your community.
That's great to hear. Why does state law prohibit? You mentioned state law prohibits having them on all the time. Why does it?
I would never guess to get in the mind of a legislator, sir.
Okay. One thing that I read in your statement, you mentioned that there's policy checks to make sure that, in other words, I think supervisors go and make sure that, to the extent possible, those body-worn cameras are being turned on when they're supposed to be.
Yes.
What does that look like?
So sergeants are required to watch a percentage of the body-worn camera, and frankly, in-car cameras. We've had in-car cameras since the early 2000s. The council was very progressive on that as well. And when we rolled out body worn cameras, we started off with, hey, don't forget to turn your cameras on. But we have had some sustained internal affairs complaints when officers have failed to turn on their cameras. And every time when we review the situation, inevitably somebody else's body camera caught it, and you could see that there was not an intention to not capture the event. They weren't trying to do it willfully, but nonetheless, it goes to holding our folks accountable. And so we, for the most part, we have good adherence to that policy of turning those cameras on.
Another question I had was community policing opportunities. I know one thing that I'll commend you, Chief, and your staff too. If there's a meeting that you're asked to participate in, you're there. I've seen you at all hours of the night, weekends, weekdays. Thank you to your family and your kids, because you are you attend meetings, you attend groups when you're asked to be there, and I appreciate that. Are there any additional and so community engagement? You're very present. Are there any opportunities for increased community policing, whereby our officers, our beat officers, get to know the citizens of our city well, and somehow build a relationship because of frequency in a neighborhood or something like that? Is there any opportunity for that, or what is that?
Yes.
Is that a good trust building mechanism? Even maybe is the right question.
Yeah, I think when people look back on neighborhood policing or community policing, they look back to the programs we had in the late 90s, where we had officers dedicated to neighborhood associations, and the reality of that is it is labor intensive, and so it's a balance that you have to play on resources. But I know that incoming manager Ford has asked us to look at the potential cost of neighborhood police or neighborhood officers. It just comes down for the patrol officers. It comes down to not enough hours in the day between calls for service. At the beginning, I talked about the fact that we answer over 100,000 calls for service a year, and that what that really turns out to be is that our officers are patrol officers, particularly, are going call to call throughout their shifts. And while they love to engage our community, and I've actually caught some flack at community meetings because they'll say, "Hey, it's good to see you, Chief, but where are your troops at?" And my response is, well, they're out answering 911 calls. 911 is great when you need a police officer, but if you talk to Assistant Chief Ginch, who was around before 911, he will say that back then you had more time because now everybody has a phone, and so every call is an in progress call, and everybody wants you there immediately, and you may get 15 calls for each incident that's going on because everybody's got a cell phone. So those officers would love to have an opportunity to engage citizens. They love that, and I think you've seen that at some community meetings, and most of all they love talking to kids and getting with the kids in the neighborhood. So there are always opportunities. I think it is just a balance that we have to take when we look at all the competing priorities in the budget, but it is certainly something we're looking at, and Mr. Ford has directed us to look at what that would look like for the Waco Police Department.
Next question. Did you just call Chief Ginch old? Is that what that?
Well, Chief Ginch is seasoned, for sure.
For sure. Okay. What are the things that you're hearing in the community? First, thank you. I get that that's a balancing act, and I do think that it is something we need to consider. And I know that we can't do everything we want, but I think it's worth examining that. Are there anything else that you're hearing in the community that you think that we need to adjust or amend or implement now?
Well, I think there are always opportunities. Folks in our community are very generous with suggestions and advice for the police department. And interestingly, one of the biggest topics I get is traffic enforcement from various districts. Traffic enforcement. In addition to traffic enforcement, we seem to have an ongoing issue of discharge of firearms calls. And I get a lot of feedback from members of the community. But our detectives and our patrol officers work diligently on those discharge of firearms calls. I just received a report in my inbox today with another 20 or 30 that we're tracking. We have arrested suspects. Unfortunately, because of COVID, folks get out of jail pretty fast. And that's part of the criminal justice system we don't have any control over. And so there are opportunities out there. We are very lucky that we are receiving the state grant for the Anti-Gang Center. And so I think once it is up and running, I just went day before yesterday and looked at the construction at that. And so we're moving along. We have formed the advisory board with Texas DPS and the McLennan County Sheriff's Office so that we're going to leverage the other agencies' resources here in Waco. We're all going to work together on those gang issues. Obviously, narcotics are still an ongoing issue that we get a lot of feedback on. Unfortunately, in 2020, we still have some open-air drug markets, and I get a lot of demand for that. The thing is, I also want to be very careful that we don't create a police state where you see a police officer on every corner and every park. The way we displace some of that out of parks, as the wise Noah Jackson told me one time, the way you get bad people out of parks is you put good people in parks. And so we have some opportunities, and for community outreach, I'd like to work with our parks department about putting some of our interim summer programs in the parks. I've talked to Director Jonathan Cook about that. Since we can't do some things because of COVID, and we're going to do some what they call recess is their program, is doing some of that in our parks. So not all of these issues that are criminal justice or crime related can be solved by police. There are a lot of these issues we can't arrest our way out of. And so we have to be thoughtful about things we do in the community related to economic development and programs and a lot of these things. And we have to get our neighborhoods involved in being part of the solution. The neighborhoods who have had the most success in displacing crime are those neighborhoods who just get fed up with it and decide they're not going to put up with it anymore. And we partner with them and bring forces to bear where we can, and we displace crime for the long term out of those neighborhoods. And so it's going to take all of us working together to do that, because we just can't arrest our way out of all these issues.
I completely agree with that. The last thing that I want to emphasize is I think that as we continue to have community conversations about this subject, one thing that is really important is communicating where we are now, so that as we discuss this, the community can know where we're sitting and go from there. It's funny how many emails I've gotten this week that have requested policy implementations for policy that have been implemented for over a decade, which is encouraging in some ways. But I think also the conversation and hopefully trust, the conversation is more productive, and trust is more established when we know where we are today and can move from there. So I would just encourage continued efforts to communicate that. I know we're doing everything we can to do that, but just emphasize continually exploring what that could look like in innovative ways to make sure that the community knows where we stand. So I'm sure this will be a conversation that we could keep having for a while, but that's all I have for today, and look forward to continuing to discuss. And again, thank you, Chief, for who you are and the department you've built.
Thank you, sir.
And I'll just, pretty much everybody's asked the things that I was curious about, so I'll just reiterate all of that. I appreciate your, thoughtful responsiveness, not only over the events of the past few weeks, but just as you've, in your role as assistant chief and chief, and just since I've known you. It's in our police force takes their cue from their leadership, and you have demonstrated just a respectful, mindful, thoughtful and right way of approaching this. So I want to just echo what everyone said. I appreciate you. And I agree that we can't arrest our way out of all of this. And, we've had discussions over the mental health issues. And you said they accounted for, I believe, 1/3 of your calls for service.
Well, every day we get 3 calls, and we've had a 36% increase over each year for the last 3 years in those calls.
Still, it makes a large component of the issues that your officers have to address. And so I think as we continue going on, working towards greater equality and understanding that law enforcement is only one facet of the inequality in our systemic institutions. But here, thanks to your leadership and thanks to the leaders that came before, is in a much better place than other parts of our country. So I want to commend y'all. I want to say thank you. I want to say I think we're approaching this in the right way, and continuing working on the mental health and other issues. I think could be very productive in moving ourselves forward as a community.
Thank you, sir.
You're on mute, Councilmember Barfield.
I thought I hit it. Sorry. Thank you so much for your report and everything that your dedication to this city and your staff and making sure that we haven't had to personally bear the brunt and burden that many cities have recently. And we attribute that to the dedication that you serve with. It is imperative right now that we all stop and remember and pause for a second about what is actually happening. We're great, I hate to use the word lucky, blessed that it has not surfaced in the manner that it has in other cities here. We will broad strokes, make statements that it's because that we've been so dedicated to equity and some of the things, but what I want to guarantee, which is, is that is because we have such strong accountability to one another. And I mean that as a community, that I am accountable for my people, just like you are accountable to your staff, just like they're accountable to you. And we are all looking and making sure that we take care of one another, because that's how community is built. And that's how we continue to grow and foster and develop our community as a whole. When we look at, as Councilmember Meek addressed earlier, community policing, and, just like I do, when Mae Jackson sat in this seat, she and Alice Rodriguez were like dead on community policing. And we saw the benefits. The city as a whole saw the benefits of what it was. There's no mistaking that people who are actually available to walk neighborhoods and go in businesses and say, hey, how you doing, to the business and shop owners make a difference. Because at that point, I know that if it comes time for me, as you said, Chief Holt, to stand up for my neighborhood, because you can't police your way out of it. Sometimes you've got to wrap your arms around and close it up yourself. I can do that if I have, the confidence that and trust that PD has my back, right? But I can't do that if I don't know. I know I've talked to, so me, I got to look at it from all kinds of perspectives. So I called every cop I knew. Especially every African-American cop I knew. And that's from all branches and agencies, from the Fed to the DPS to constables to, other PDs. And I was like, okay, from the policy perspective, what are we missing? What is it that, we can do to make sure? And he said, well, there's no, and each of them, men and women alike. And they said that there's no, you can't policy your way out of this until you wrap the whole community involved in it. So I say all that to say, I am going to continue to ask that, from a city management perspective, we find a way to make a pathway. If it's got to be a hybrid program that adds a form of community and neighborhood policing in it, that's something we focus on. Because I was watching something on Facebook, whatever, Instagram, and a man owned a building, and he was painting a Black Lives Matter tag on the steps leading up to the building. He was outside painting it, and the woman stopped and she says, I appreciate your message, but you can't deface property like this. And so they go back and forth about it. And he was like, well, I'm not doing anything wrong. She was like, this is private property. I know the owner. And he was like, oh, okay, well, you may want to call the police. So they call the police. The police officer rolls by. He looks at the gentleman, realizing that that's the building owner, because he knew that as a neighborhood police officer. And, he was like, ma'am, he owns the building. You do what he wants to with his steps. But imagine had he not known that man. We would have been looking at a whole nother situation. And, and I think that that's imperative that we go through. I mean, I know just from the businesses that are in my district, the difference that it makes that you all pop in every now and then and ask and check on them how they're doing. I mean, and that's personal and that goes deep and it means a lot. And I think that that's the only way we're going to continue to solidify this already shored up foundation that we have in Waco with PD, is to continue and grow the efforts of community policing, neighborhood policing, because it's relational. I mean, I get the law is the law and these are transactions and, ipso facto 1, 2, but the relational part, you can't, that can't happen out inside a car. And that can't happen if I don't know, anything about the children in the neighborhood. It just can't. And looking at the reimagining policing things, I agree with you wholeheartedly and look forward to the development and support that happens with the behavior team out of the Colorado model. I think that our foundations have seen the intensity that we need that kind of support and are looking to support you and as well as the county. And we appreciate that kind of stuff because there has got to be a way for us to compartmentalize because, police officers are police officers. I don't know when you all became therapists and psychologists and all the things that you're expected to be. But it's a level that has to add to a burden that you have to bear in your job and responsibility. So any assistance that we can get to help you all with that is a priority for us because wellness of our city is our goal, period. I am curious and want to know what's next in our steps. I know you spoke about Deputy City Manager Ford and that he would be looking to see how, that you are all addressing where we can go with community policing. But, I want to know what's next with that. I also am curious, as you have, and we've seen nationally, these officers who have multiple complaints against them, is there some sort of internal document that tracks personal complaints, specifically use of force complaints on officers? If it exists as a whole, does it exist here? And, how do you keep from, I know in education, they passing bad teachers and you just move from department to department. So, is there a way to track that? You mentioned I know that the legislature is now going back to do some more work that was left out in the Sandra Bland Act in 2017 because, unfortunately, it got whittled down to the bare bones because it did nothing at the end when we got to an agreeable act to address racial profiling and any of those things. And it ended up being a mental health bill, but there were some things that were tragically left on the House floor about the Sandra Bland Act. And so I'm hoping that they do get to more things about that. And I appreciate the fact that in your diligence and quest to continue to bring equity and education in your force that you've seen, been to San Jose and done REI and all the leadership have done that because those things impact how that level of trust is built and continues to be fortified within our district. I think people need to know that more. I don't know that enough people know all the steps that you've taken and that several members of the police force and city management team went to do those things. That's something that we have to continually say and find in our marketing. You know, if you don't tell your story, who's going to tell it for you? And I mean, I don't know that anybody needs to give you a cookie because you did what you were supposed to do. But if they don't know you did it, you know, Pixar, it didn't happen. We are in a digital age. And so I need for, you know, people to understand that our police department are taking those steps and, you know, understand that, you know, historically what policing in the United States was meant to do, and how just because you walk in a room, that could, you know, it's a whole nother story if you walk, you know, weren't invited in this door and just walk in, what that could mean and what that could trigger. And that is, it's very different, and people don't have any idea about that. But the fact that you did make sure in your course of education to learn and know the difference is important. So, you know, whatever I can do to assist in helping get that message communicated, I am wholeheartedly willing to do that because I think it's important. And I thank you in advance for the work that you will be doing to continue to galvanize our community and create a pathway for more of those young men and women who are playing ball in the park to look up and see officers and say, you know what, I want to be like Officer Holt. And so then that forwards policing in our community, because it's going to come from our roots. You know, it's the soil has already been cultivated to speak that. And so we understand, and we have more homegrown officers who know and love Waco like we do. That's a good day.
Thank you so much.
Chief, I really do appreciate this presentation. I think it's been very worthwhile, and I have expressed many times how proud I am of our force and the job that you have done and that prior chiefs have done to reach out to communities of color, to understand the REI race equity training is obviously a huge piece of that, but also the connections that you've formed with various leaders have been really meaningful. You know, none of this can keep a bad situation like the murder of George Floyd from happening in Waco. I mean, that's the reality. You could have a bad situation, but we're doing everything. I think we're doing everything that can reasonably be done to try to keep that from happening. And so, you know, I want us to pat ourselves on the back, but I don't want us to kid ourselves that nothing like that could ever happen in Waco, Texas, because the reality is it could. But we've got great police officers who are, you know, I'm so proud of every police officer I know on the Waco Police Force. I'm impressed with them. I know what a difficult job they do. And I know that I don't even understand how difficult and dangerous it is. So, you know, I do think we need to continue to have conversations about next steps and whether there is a version of neighborhood policing that we can afford and that we can implement here in Waco. So I look forward to continued conversations about this. And it needs to be, you know, we don't need a knee-jerk reaction based on the national outcry that has been such an important message that needs to be heard. We need a thoughtful, continuing, ongoing conversation about this, and I know that we will have that. What I don't want to have is for us to have this conversation today and then it ends there, because there's too much work still that needs to be done. So thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything that else they want to add before we close here on this item, Chief? Anything further?
No, I think we've covered a lot of it. We'll certainly bring you additional information and discussion moving forward.
Okay, very good. We're going to have to skip the budget item. We have a budget and audit meeting coming up, I believe, sometime in the next few days, next couple of weeks. So we can cover that item there. Are there any requests for future agenda items?
As we prepare for budget, and I know that it just been something looking at, I was wondering if I could get staff to give an analysis of our top 10 contractors who we use by dollar amount. So I can just see how that's going as far as the contractors that we use, and that's in all departments. But just who are the where are we spending our most money?
Yes, ma'am, we can get that for you.
Thank you.
Anything else? Okay, we will now recess the work session and reconvene regular session for executive session as read into the record by the city secretary at 5:31 p.m.
Notice is hereby given that the City Council will go into executive session in accordance with the following provisions. 1, Personnel, Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.074, City Council Member for District 4. 2, Personnel, Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.074, Future City Manager Bradley Ford. 3, Real Property, Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.072. And 4, Economic Development, Texas Open Meetings Act, Section 551.087. We are now in executive session at 5:31 p.m.